Endure the Alpha King's touch, Omega. The cold Alpha King claimed a forbidden Omega Queen. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character, Elena Moore, who stood at the center of the high stone hall where winter light filtered through tall windows and turned the air pale and still, her hands folded, her shoulders steady, her presence small only to those who chose not to look closely, because Elena had learned early that silence could be a shield and patience a form of strength. And today patience was all she was allowed to carry with her as the court gathered, murmurs settling into expectation. Eyes tracking the approach of the throne where King Alaric Wolf ruled with a composure that felt colder than the marble beneath her feet, a man spoken of as distant and unyielding, whose voice could quiet a room without effort, whose gaze carried decisions like final verdicts. And yet as he descended the steps, the space between them seemed to narrow until the room itself felt like it was holding its breath, Elena aware of every heartbeat, every measured step, every glance cast her way that expected her to flinch, to lower her head further, to remember the rules written for someone like her, rules that said an Omega should endure without question, should be present without being seen, should accept touch only as permission allowed. And when Alaric's hand hovered near hers, not grasping, not forceful, merely present, the hush deepened, because everyone knew the weight of that moment, knew the line being tested. And Elena did not pull away, she did not tremble. She simply breathed, steady and calm, grounding herself in the knowledge that dignity did not require permission, that respect could be claimed by standing firm. And the king noticed, not with surprise, but with an assessing stillness that softened the sharp edges of his reputation, his eyes searching her face not for weakness but for resolve. And in that quiet exchange the court sensed a shift they could not name, a recognition forming not from command but from acknowledgement, as if the cold space between rank and worth was thinning, and Elena understood then that endurance was not surrender, that standing still could be an act of courage. And as Alaric straightened, the air changed, expectation turning into something new, something uncertain, and Elena lifted her gaze just enough to meet his, discovering in that shared moment that the story unfolding was not about her place on the floor, but about what happens when strength recognizes strength. And the hall waited, unaware that the rules they clung to were already beginning to bend. Elena Moore felt the weight of the hall long after the king returned to his place, because silence had a way of lingering when something unspoken had shifted, and as the court slowly resumed its measured breathing, she remained exactly where she stood, neither invited forward nor dismissed, existing in that narrow space Omegas learned to occupy, visible enough to be judged yet invisible enough to be ignored. And it was there that her history followed her like a quiet shadow, a life shaped by rules written before she had learned to speak, rules that said her presence was permitted only when useful and her voice valuable only when quiet. And while the nobles whispered behind raised hands, Elena listened not to them, but to the steady rhythm of her own breath, grounding herself in memories of smaller rooms and colder nights, of learning to endure without bitterness, because bitterness required energy she could not afford to waste. And she remembered the first time she had been told she was forbidden, not for anything she had done but for what she was, an Omega born outside approved lines, raised without banners or protection, taught early that survival depended on knowing when to stand still and when to step back. Yet today she had done neither, and the awareness of that choice settled into her chest with a calm that surprised her, because she had not acted out of defiance or hope, only out of a quiet certainty that she would not shrink further. And somewhere above her, King Alaric Wolf observed the room with the same composed distance he always carried, though his attention returned to Elena more than once, not as a challenge but as an unanswered question, because she had not reacted the way others did, not with fear or appeal, but with an even steadiness that suggested something deeper than obedience. And it unsettled the neat categories the court relied upon, categories that made power easy to understand, and Elena sensed it in the way conversations softened when she passed, in the way glances lingered a second longer, not cruel now, but uncertain, as if the presence they had dismissed for years had suddenly gained weight. And when the formal proceedings moved on, she was guided to the side, not escorted away, not corrected, simply placed where she could see and be seen. And that alone felt like a quiet rupture in tradition, because forbidden omegas were rarely kept close, rarely allowed to witness anything that mattered. And as the afternoon light shifted across the stone floor, Elena let her thoughts settle, reminding herself that one moment did not rewrite a lifetime, that recognition was not safety, and yet she could not ignore the sense that something had begun, subtle but irreversible, like a door opening just enough to let air move through a closed room. And she wondered if the king felt it too, the pressure of expectation building not from the crowd, but from the bond of attention that now existed between them, a bond not named and not yet claimed, but undeniably present. And as the court adjourned, Elena prepared herself for what came next, not knowing whether she would be summoned or dismissed, only knowing that whatever followed would demand the same composure she had carried into the hall, because endurance was not about waiting to be chosen. It was about choosing to remain whole no matter who was watching. And as she turned toward the long corridor leading away from the chamber, she did so with her head level, aware that the path ahead was uncertain, but certain of one thing, that she would no longer walk it unseen. The corridor carried Elena more away from the great hall into a quieter wing of the palace where footsteps echoed softer, and the air smelled faintly of old stone and winter polish. And with each step she felt the attention of the court fade behind her, replaced by a more private awareness of what she had done simply by remaining present, because for omegas like her the rules were not shouted but assumed, enforced by habit and silence. And she had lived long enough inside those boundaries to know exactly where they pressed. Yet today the pressure felt different, less like a weight and more like a test, as if the palace itself were measuring her resolve, and she walked with the steady pace she had learned in years of service, not rushing, not lingering, letting her composure speak where words were unnecessary. And it was there, between tall pillars and narrow windows, that the laws of the realm made themselves felt again, not as commands but as memories, reminders that forbidden did not mean dangerous but inconvenient, something set aside to keep order simple. And Elena understood that simplicity had always favored those already in power, while others learned to adapt quietly. And as she passed a small alcove, she caught her reflection in polished stone, not regal, not meek, simply present, a woman shaped by endurance rather than entitlement. And she straightened, almost without thinking, because posture had become a form of language for her. And somewhere above, in chambers that overlooked the courtyard, King Alaric Wolf reviewed petitions with a practiced detachment, yet his thoughts returned to the moment in the hall, to the calm refusal in Elena's stillness to be diminished, because he had ruled long enough to recognize performance. And what he had seen was not defiance crafted for attention but authenticity that did not ask to be rewarded. And that unsettled him more than open challenge ever had, since the laws he upheld were built to maintain balance, not to test it. And yet balance depended on truth, and truth had a way of surfacing when least expected. And as Elena reached the end of the corridor, she was paused by a gentle request rather than an order, a court attendant informing her that she was to wait, not as punishment, not as dismissal, simply to remain available. And she accepted with a nod, taking a seat near a window where afternoon light traced the stone floor, and she waited as she always had, with patience that was neither hopeful nor resentful, just ready. And in that waiting she reflected on how easily a life could be defined by absence, by what one was not permitted to touch, see, or claim, and how quietly those absences could shape a person into something resilient rather than broken. And she realized that if the king chose to summon her, she would answer without fear, not because she trusted power, but because she trusted herself to remain grounded regardless of outcome. And when the doors at the far end opened at last, revealing a figure approaching with measured steps, Elena did not rise immediately, choosing instead to meet the moment with the same calm that had carried her through the hall, because whatever words were spoken next would matter less than the way she received them. And as King Alaric Wolf stopped a respectful distance away, his expression unreadable yet attentive, The space between them felt deliberate, not imposed. And in that space lay the unspoken question of law versus recognition, of tradition versus truth, and Elena met his gaze without challenge, without appeal, understanding that endurance had brought her here, but honesty would decide what followed. King Alaric Wolf spoke first, his voice calm and measured, not loud yet impossible to ignore, asking Elena more to walk with him through the adjoining gallery, where the lights softened and the palace seemed less like a seat of judgment and more like a place that remembered history. And she rose then, following at a respectful distance, aware that every step carried meaning whether intended or not, because an Omega walking beside the Alpha King, even without contact, challenged unspoken expectations. And as they moved past tapestries depicting old laws and long-settled alliances, Alaric explained the rule that governed her status, the ancient statute that marked certain bloodlines as forbidden not for wrongdoing but for balance, a balance defined generations ago by those who feared what they did not fully understand. And Elena listened without interruption, absorbing each word with the same attentiveness she had given harsher truths in her life, because she knew knowledge itself was a form of power. And when they stopped before a tall window overlooking the courtyard, Alaric turned slightly, extending his hand not as command but as test, explaining that the law required proof of tolerance, a ritual of acknowledgement meant to confirm whether an Omega could endure the presence of royal authority without distress. And Elena understood the weight of the moment immediately, not because of fear, but because she recognized the eyes that would later interpret the outcome. And she placed her hand in his with deliberate steadiness, aware of the difference in temperature, the strength held in restraint rather than force. And she focused on remaining present, breathing evenly, grounding herself in the certainty that her worth was not defined by this moment. And around them the air felt still, as if the palace itself were waiting, and Alaric watched her closely, not for submission but for truth, noticing how she neither leaned into the contact nor recoiled, how her posture remained balanced, her gaze level, conveying respect without erasure. And it struck him that endurance did not look like suffering in her. It looked like choice. And when he released her hand after a measured count, the silence that followed felt heavier than the ritual itself, because something expected had not occurred, and Elena felt it too. The subtle shift from examination to recognition, and though no proclamation was made, the meaning lingered in the space between them. And Alaric spoke again, acknowledging her composure, not praising, not diminishing, simply stating fact, which in a world built on hierarchy carried more weight than flattery. And Elena responded with equal simplicity, thanking him without deference or challenge, just acknowledgement. And as they resumed walking, she sensed that the path ahead had narrowed not because options were taken away, but because clarity was forming, and the gallery seemed longer on the return, the light changing as clouds passed overhead. And Elena realized that the ritual meant to define her limits had instead revealed the limits of the law itself, because it had assumed fragility where there was balance. And when they parted at the threshold of the inner court, Alaric paused, informing her that the council would be notified of what he had observed, not as judgment, but as record. And Elena inclined her head, accepting uncertainty with the same calm she had carried all day. And as she walked away once more, she understood that endurance had brought her through the test, but it was her refusal to disappear within it that had truly been seen. And behind her, King Alaric Wolf remained still for a moment longer than necessary, aware that the rules he upheld had just been quietly challenged by someone who had never raised her voice. The hours that followed unfolded with a careful slowness that Elena more recognized as deliberate, because after the ritual there were no immediate declarations, only observation, and she was returned to her assigned quarters near the inner court, a place modest but quiet, where the sounds of the palace drifted in softened echoes. And there she sat by the window, watching shadows stretch across the stone paths below, aware that her actions had entered a space usually reserved for decisions made far from Omega voices. And she understood that waiting now carried a different weight, not passive but expectant, because once attention was drawn it did not simply vanish. And across the palace King Alaric Wolf convened a limited council, not the full assembly, but those whose counsel he trusted to be measured rather than reactive. and he presented his observation without embellishment, describing Elena's response with precision, emphasizing what had not occurred as much as what had, because the absence of distress challenged the premise of the statute itself, and the council listened with restrained expressions, some cautious, some unsettled, because laws that endured for generations rarely welcomed scrutiny. Yet none could dispute the king's account, and as discussion unfolded, Elena felt the shift indirectly, not through words but through atmosphere, in the way servants spoke more carefully when they passed her door, in the way she was not redirected or corrected when she moved through certain halls, small permissions that spoke of uncertainty rather than acceptance, and she met them with the same composure she always carried, refusing to assume intention where none had been stated, because she knew too well how quickly assumptions could reverse. And as evening approached, she was requested, not summoned, to attend a small gathering in the adjoining chamber, where officials reviewed schedules and duties, and she understood the significance immediately, because forbidden omegas were rarely included in procedural spaces, and she entered without hesitation, standing quietly at the side, listening as responsibilities were assigned, noting how her presence altered the cadence of conversation, how pauses lengthened before certain phrases, and she sensed that she was being weighed not for usefulness but for consequence. And when King Alaric entered the room, the discussion shifted again, his presence grounding the space, and his eyes met hers briefly, acknowledging without signaling, and that simple acknowledgment steadied her more than any reassurance could have, because it suggested continuity rather than exception, and as the meeting concluded, he addressed the group with calm authority, stating that the statute concerning forbidden omegas would undergo formal review, not suspension, not repeal, simply examination, and the words settled like quiet thunder, because review implied possibility, and Elena felt the significance without allowing it to show, understanding that attention could harden into resistance if met too eagerly, and later, as night settled over the palace and lights flickered on along the corridors, Elena returned to her room with measured steps, aware that her role remained undefined. But that definition itself was shifting, and she reflected on how endurance had always been framed as survival. Yet today it had become a form of presence that demanded recognition without demanding permission, and she realized that whatever followed would require not only patience but clarity, because once rules were questioned, they did not return to their original shape, and as she prepared for rest, she allowed herself a single steady breath of acknowledgement, not of triumph, but of readiness, knowing that the path ahead would test not only the law, but the willingness of those in power to see beyond it. And in the quiet of the palace, with the moon casting pale light across the courtyard, Elena more understood that endurance had carried her this far, but what came next would ask her to stand not just firm, but visible, and she accepted that truth with calm resolve. Morning arrived with a muted light that slipped through the palace windows and settled across the stone floors like a held breath, and Elena more felt the change before anyone spoke it aloud, because the palace had a way of signaling when something important was about to surface. And as she moved through her routine with steady intention, she noticed how doors opened without pause and how messages arrived addressed to her by name rather than title, small signals that suggested a recalibration was underway. And when the request came for her presence in the council antechamber, it carried no urgency, only inevitability, and she entered the space with the same calm that had guided her through every threshold so far, aware that the gathered faces reflected a range of responses from curiosity to concern, because review had turned into inquiry, and inquiry had a way of uncovering truths long set aside. And King Alaric Wolf stood at the center of the room, not elevated, not distant, choosing a position that placed him among those he addressed rather than above them, and he spoke plainly, stating that the statute regarding forbidden omegas contained assumptions no longer supported by observation, and the room responded with measured debate rather than outrage, because his authority framed the discussion as necessary rather than disruptive, and Elena listened as references were made to historical precedents, to old interpretations that favored stability over nuance. And she understood that change rarely announced itself with certainty. It arrived through careful acknowledgement of what no longer fit, and when attention turned toward her, it was not to demand justification but to invite clarity, and Elena spoke only when asked, describing her experience without embellishment, emphasizing not endurance as suffering but composure as choice. And her words carried weight precisely because they did not seek it. And as the exchange unfolded, something subtle occurred that no one had anticipated. A quiet alignment in the room as understanding spread not through argument, but recognition, because truth presented calmly had a way of reordering priorities, and Alaric observed this shift with focused attention, noting how resistance softened into consideration, and he felt a familiar sensation of inevitability, the sense that once a path became visible, walking it was less a decision than a responsibility. And as the council recessed, he asked Elena to remain, not for interrogation but conversation, and when the room cleared, the silence between them felt different than before, less formal, more deliberate, and Alaric acknowledged that the review had revealed an oversight in how strength had been defined, admitting that the law had mistaken endurance for fragility simply because it did not present as dominance. And Elena received the admission without triumph, understanding that recognition mattered more than apology, and as they spoke, a quiet resonance settled in, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like two truths aligning, and Alaric recognized it as the same certainty he relied upon when making decisions that shaped the realm, the assurance that clarity had been reached, and he stated then, without ceremony, that the council would proceed with formal revision, and that until completion, Elena would be recognized as protected under his authority, not elevated, not hidden, simply acknowledged. And the words carried the force of intention rather than decree, and Elena felt the significance settle into her bones, not as relief, but as grounding, because protection implied visibility, and visibility demanded responsibility, and as they parted, she understood that the review marked a turning point, not only for her status but for the framework that had defined many lives like hers, and in the quiet that followed, Elena more accepted that the moment of endurance had become a moment of recognition, and that recognition, once given, could not be quietly withdrawn, and somewhere within the palace, a new balance was beginning to form, guided not by tradition alone, but by the willingness to see clearly. The announcement came at dusk, delivered with the measured clarity the palace reserved for matters that would ripple beyond its walls. And Elena more learned of it not through whispers, but through a formal notice requesting her presence in the great hall once more, a return that carried a different weight than before, because this time her steps were anticipated. And as she entered the chamber, the assembled court rose in a reflex shaped by habit rather than instruction, a movement that surprised many, including Elena herself, and she paused just long enough to acknowledge the room before proceeding to the place indicated, near the dais but not beneath it, a position that balanced respect with visibility, and King Alaric Wolf stood before the throne, his posture composed, his expression attentive rather than distant, signaling that what followed would be spoken plainly, and he addressed the court without flourish, stating that the review of the statute had reached a conclusion supported by evidence and observation, that the assumptions which defined forbidden status had failed to account for resilience that did not present as dominance, and that the realm could not afford laws that misidentified strength. And as the words settled, Elena felt the room recalibrate around her, resistance yielding to recognition not through force but clarity, and Alaric continued, acknowledging Elena by name, not by rank, and affirming that her conduct had demonstrated composure, agency, and balance consistent with leadership rather than submission, and the significance of that acknowledgement moved through the hall in a visible wave, because names carried power, and to speak one publicly was to anchor it in record, and Elena remained still, allowing the moment to exist without reaching for it, understanding that composure now mattered more than ever. And when Alaric concluded that the realm would recognize her under royal protection with full standing to speak, to be present, and to be seen, the declaration was not framed as exception but correction, and the court responded with a measured silence that marked acceptance. And Elena felt the quiet certainty of a boundary shifting, not collapsing but widening. And as the king stepped down from the dais, he closed the distance between them deliberately, stopping at an arm's length that signaled respect rather than possession, and he extended his hand, not as a test this time, but as acknowledgement, and Elena met the gesture with equal steadiness, placing her hand in his without hesitation, aware that the simple act carried meaning precisely because it was witnessed, and Alaric spoke again, his voice calm, yet resolute, stating that from this moment forward she would stand beside him in matters where perspective mattered, not as symbol, but as participant, and the court absorbed the implication with a collective stillness, because standing beside the Alpha King redefined proximity to power. And Elena understood the responsibility inherent in the gesture, accepting it not with awe but with readiness. And as their hands parted, the space between them felt defined rather than uncertain, a shared understanding formed without need for elaboration, and the hall seemed brighter as evening light filtered through the high windows, casting long reflections across the floor, and Elena recognized that what had been forbidden was not her presence, but the willingness to see it clearly. And as the court dispersed, conversations carried a different tone, less guarded, more deliberate, and Elena remained where she was until the room emptied, grounding herself in the knowledge that recognition did not end struggle, but clarified purpose. And when she finally turned to leave, she did so with measured confidence, aware that endurance had carried her to this threshold, and recognition had opened the way beyond it. And behind her, King Alaric Wolf watched with focused attention, understanding that the realm had just acknowledged a truth it could no longer ignore. The days that followed carried a new rhythm through the palace, subtle yet unmistakable, and Elena more felt it in the way her name appeared on schedules without explanation, in the way discussions paused to allow her presence to settle before continuing, and in the way her steps were no longer redirected but anticipated, because recognition had shifted expectation, and expectation reshaped behavior. And Elena navigated this change with deliberate care, aware that visibility could invite misunderstanding if met with haste, so she chose consistency, arriving on time, listening fully, speaking only when clarity was needed. And in doing so she discovered that influence did not require volume, it required alignment. And across the hallways and chambers, King Alaric Wolf observed how the court adjusted around her, noting which voices softened, which resisted, and which leaned toward understanding, because leadership demanded attention not only to policy but to people. And Elena had become a quiet measure of the realm's readiness to evolve. And as she participated in reviews and planning sessions, she brought perspective shaped by endurance rather than privilege, offering insights that reframed problems without accusation, and the effect was cumulative, each contribution reinforcing the legitimacy already granted, until her presence felt less like a change and more like a correction long overdue. And one evening, as the palace prepared for a formal gathering meant to mark the conclusion of the review process, Elena stood in the antechamber adjusting the simple clasp at her wrist, aware that ceremony amplified meaning, and she chose attire that reflected balance rather than display, understanding that symbolism mattered. And when she entered the hall beside Alaric, not behind him and not ahead, the alignment spoke more clearly than any declaration, because proximity suggested trust, and trust shaped perception. And throughout the gathering, conversations unfolded with an ease Elena had not expected, questions directed to her without condescension, responses received without dismissal, and she answered with measured honesty, grounding each exchange in the shared goal of stability through understanding. And Alaric noted the way the room responded, how authority expanded rather than diminished when shared with intention. And as the evening progressed, the formalities gave way to quieter moments, and Elena found herself standing near the windows overlooking the courtyard where lantern light traced gentle arcs across the stone, and she reflected on how quickly certainty could form when truth was allowed space. And Alaric joined her there, not to command but to observe, and in the quiet he acknowledged the steadiness she had maintained, noting that leadership often revealed itself through restraint rather than assertion. And Elena received the observation with a nod, recognizing it as mutual understanding rather than praise. And as the gathering drew to a close, the court dispersed with a sense of completion, not finality but foundation, and Elena felt the calm that followed purposeful work, the satisfaction of alignment achieved without force. And as she returned to her quarters that night, she considered the path ahead, aware that recognition created responsibility, and responsibility required vigilance, and she welcomed that truth without apprehension, because endurance had taught her patience, recognition had granted her voice, and together they formed a steadiness she could rely upon. And somewhere within the palace, as lights dimmed and corridors quieted, the realm adjusted its balance once more, not dramatically, but decisively, guided by the understanding that strength could be gentle, that authority could listen, and that what had once been forbidden had become essential. And Elena more rested with the knowledge that the change was not complete, but it was real, and real change, once acknowledged, did not retreat. The final gathering unfolded beneath a clear evening sky, the palace courtyard illuminated by steady lantern light that reflected off stone paths worn smooth by generations, and Elena more stood beside King Alaric Wolf at the edge of the assembled court, aware that this moment carried a different kind of weight, not one of declaration but of direction, because the realm had listened and now watched to see what would follow. And Alaric addressed them with the calm authority that had come to define his reign, speaking not of conquest or command but of continuity, stating that the strength of a kingdom was measured not only by how it protected itself, but by how it recognized those who had always upheld it quietly. And as his words settled, Elena felt the stillness deepen, not tense but attentive, and she understood that the story unfolding was no longer about her alone, but about what her presence had revealed. And when Alaric turned toward her, the gesture was unhurried, deliberate, and he spoke her name clearly, affirming before all that her steadiness, judgment, and resilience had earned a place not beside the throne by exception, but within the future it represented, and he stated that she would serve as queen not in contrast to his authority, but in balance with it, a role defined not by dominance, but by discernment. And the title carried through the courtyard with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And Elena met the moment without surprise, because she had felt its approach in every measured step that had led her here, and she inclined her head in acknowledgment, not submission, understanding that acceptance carried responsibility as much as honor, and the court responded with a unified stillness that marked agreement, not because they were compelled, but because the path had been made clear. And as the gathering concluded, conversations resumed with a new cadence, one shaped by alignment rather than resistance. And Elena moved through the space with calm confidence, responding to greetings with the same respect she had always offered. Because elevation had not altered her understanding of worth, it had clarified it. And later, as the courtyard emptied and the lanterns burned lower, Elena and Alaric walked together along the outer terrace, overlooking the lands that stretched beyond the palace walls. And in the quiet he acknowledged that the decision had been inevitable once truth was seen, that the realm required balance as much as strength, and Elena reflected that endurance had taught her how to wait, but recognition had taught her how to stand. And together they considered the work ahead, aware that leadership was not an endpoint but a practice renewed each day. And as the night air settled around them, Elena felt a steady assurance take root, not rooted in title or position, but in purpose, because she had not been chosen to symbolize change. She had become change by remaining herself when the world expected less. And as dawn would come and new challenges would rise, she was ready to meet them with the same composure that had carried her from the edge of the hall to the center of the realm. And in that readiness lay the true promise of the future, a future shaped not by fear of difference, but by the courage to recognize it. And as the palace lights dimmed and the stars emerged overhead, Elena more stood not as what she had endured, but as what she had become, a queen whose strength was gentle, whose presence was steady, and whose story would guide the realm forward long after the night had passed.